In the year 1845, nestled deep within the pine-covered isolation of rural Maine, lay a small, scarcely known village called Parker. At first glance, Parker appeared to be like any other 19th-century settlement, simple wooden homes lining a single dirt road, a humble church with a steeple that tilted slightly in the wind, and a tight-knit community that lived by the rhythms of farming seasons and Sunday sermons. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, secrets, and superstitions. A place that kept to itself and liked it that way. But that quietness would be shattered by something so grim, so disturbing, that it would become one of the most whispered about unsolved mysteries in New England's history. The Parker family was among the town's more respected households. John and Ruth Parker were hard-working people with deep roots in the community. John ran a small timber mill at the edge of the woods, and Ruth, known for her herbal remedies, often helped deliver babies and prepare poultices for the sick. But it wasn't the parents who drew attention that fateful year, it was their daughters. 4 girls, each born roughly 2 years apart: Margaret, aged 17, Abigail, 15, Eliza, 13, and the youngest, Clara, just 11. The sisters were known not just for their remarkable beauty, deep-set eyes, pale skin, and long chestnut hair, but for something else. People often said the girls had a strange way about them, a quietness that was too quiet, a manner too synchronized. They rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, it was often in whispers. Some said they communicated in glances and half-smiles, as if sharing private thoughts no one else could hear. Others joked nervously that the girls were like one soul divided into 4. It wasn't until the first snow of November that the unsettling events began. Margaret, the eldest, was the first to fall ill. She had been helping her father at the mill when she collapsed suddenly, her hands shaking uncontrollably and her eyes wide open in terror. At first, people assumed it was exhaustion or a seizure, but as her condition worsened, it became clear something else was at play. Her fever spiked unnaturally high, her skin turned ashen, and she began muttering strange phrases in her sleep, phrases that no one recognized and couldn't be traced to any known language. Despite the efforts of local doctors and Ruth's homemade tinctures, Margaret died within 3 days. The town was in shock, but chalked it up to illness. Maybe an infection, maybe something she ate. But then, only 10 days later, Abigail developed the same symptoms. Same convulsions. Same fever. Same vacant stare that seemed to look through people, not at them. Ruth Parker reportedly said she felt as though her daughter was speaking to something in the room that no one else could see. When Abigail died, the town began to murmur. 2 healthy girls gone in such a short time, with no reasonable explanation. By the time Eliza succumbed in early December, panic was spreading. People avoided the Parker family home. Ruth was seen weeping outside the church, clutching a Bible with torn pages. Some said they heard her praying in tongues. Others claimed they saw strange lights in the woods behind the mill, bluish and flickering, like lanterns that vanished when approached. Clara, the youngest, was no longer seen playing in the fields. She stayed inside the darkened house, barely speaking. Her face became gaunt, her eyes even larger, more hollow. John Parker began to show signs of cracking under the weight of grief and suspicion. He quit the mill, boarded up the windows of their home, and nailed crucifixes over every doorway. Clara's death, which came just before Christmas, was the most horrific. Neighbors said they heard screaming, high-pitched, unrelenting, for hours before it abruptly stopped. When the town doctor entered the house, he left minutes later, pale and silent. He refused to describe what he saw in the room, only saying, it wasn't natural. No funeral was held. The girls were buried at the edge of town in unmarked graves, per the family's request. Not long after, the Parkers disappeared entirely. Some said they moved west. Others believed they perished in the same house, leaving their ghosts behind. The property was left abandoned, and over the years, nature swallowed it whole. The Parker case didn't make national headlines. It was barely recorded in local newspapers. But the town remembered. They still do. Generations pass down the story in hushed tones, about the 4 sisters who died one by one, and the silent science has kept about what really happened. Because what happened in Parker in 1845 didn't just confuse doctors, it frightened them. The strange pattern of the Parker sisters' deaths was what set this case apart from ordinary tragedies. In most medical mysteries, there is at least some variation, differences in symptoms, timing, or causes that help researchers piece together the puzzle. But with the Parker sisters, the pattern was eerily precise, almost unnaturally so. Each girl, despite being of different ages, succumbed to the exact same sequence of events, and they did so like clockwork, as if something was following a script no human could explain. Margaret was the first, and when she fell ill, the town assumed it was a freak occurrence. She had been healthy, strong, and by all accounts in the bloom of youth. But on November 3rd, while helping her father stack freshly cut timber near the mill, she suddenly stopped moving. Witnesses said she stood perfectly still for several minutes, her eyes wide open, her pupils dilated. When John Parker called her name, she didn't respond. Then, without warning, her body seized up, her arms contorted at unnatural angles, and she collapsed onto the cold ground. By the time they carried her home, she was shaking so violently that 3 adults had to hold her down. The town doctor, a man named Elias Cromwell, was summoned. He could find no fever at first, no obvious sign of infection or injury. But as night fell, Margaret's body temperature rose sharply. Her skin turned a waxy, grayish-white, and her breathing became shallow, almost mechanical. The worst part, as reported by her mother, was the whispering. Margaret whispered constantly for hours, but not in English. She spoke in a strange, guttural language that no one in the room recognized. Her eyes remained open the entire time, even when her lips moved, and the tone of her voice was soft but deliberate, as if reciting something memorized. 3 days later, she died. No doctor could explain the cause. There was no sign of disease, no trauma, and no injury. Her body was buried quickly due to fear of contagion, but the town moved on, believing it to be an isolated case. Then, exactly 10 days after Margaret's collapse, her sister Abigail showed the same symptoms. It happened in almost identical fashion. She had been sewing with her mother by the kitchen window when her hands suddenly froze mid-stitch. She dropped the needle and stared into space, unblinking. According to Ruth Parker, Abigail's lips started to tremble first, then her hands, then her entire body. Again, the seizures began. Again, the strange language followed, whispered at a near-constant pace through cracked lips. Some who overheard her said the words weren't entirely unfamiliar, they sounded like bits of Latin mixed with something older, something no one could quite place. The townspeople began to panic. Rumors of witchcraft, curses, and unholy pacts spread quickly, even though the Parker family had always been respected. Abigail died 3 days after her first symptoms appeared, just like Margaret. Her body, too, was buried without delay, and whispers of something unnatural began to circulate more openly. When Eliza fell ill, it became impossible to deny the pattern. 13 years old, Eliza had always been the quietest of the sisters. Her sickness followed the same timeline: sudden paralysis, then violent trembling, then a rapid rise in body temperature that defied explanation. She, too, spoke in the same strange, rhythmic language. Her body tensed in the same poses. Her eyes never closed, even as she became unconscious. This time, however, a few of the townspeople gathered around the Parker home to witness the events firsthand. A midwife swore she saw Eliza's lips moving even when her lungs stopped drawing breath. She was pronounced dead by the same doctor, under the same conditions, after exactly 3 days. Clara, the youngest, became sick in December. By then, the entire town of Parker, Maine, was frozen in fear. They kept detailed records of the timing, noting that each girl had fallen ill roughly 10 days apart, each had suffered from identical symptoms, and each had died precisely 72 hours after the onset. Clara's case followed the same grim script, but her death was even more violent. Her seizures intensified to the point where her bones reportedly cracked from the force. Her eyes rolled back, her tongue bled from biting, and the strange language she whispered grew louder, echoing through the house. Several witnesses said they could hear voices answering back, though no one else was in the room. The precision of the pattern defied all known medical logic of the time, and even now, no researcher has provided a clear explanation for why the four Parker sisters died in such a methodical, chilling sequence. As the strange deaths of the Parker sisters unfolded, whispers of unnatural phenomena began to ripple through the town. Parker, Maine, had always been a place where folklore quietly simmered beneath daily life, but after the deaths of the four girls, that folklore began to feel dangerously real. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen, heard, and felt near the Parker home during those grim weeks. What started as subtle oddities soon escalated into full-blown accounts of unexplained events, and the town's fear deepened into something closer to dread. One of the first reports came from a local boy named Thomas Finch, who was just 12 years old at the time. Thomas had been tasked with bringing kindling to the Parker house during the first snowstorm of November, shortly after Margaret's collapse but before her death. As he approached the house, he claimed he saw something standing in the woods behind the property. At first, he thought it was John Parker, but as he got closer, he realized the figure wasn't moving, it was simply there, motionless, facing the house. Thomas described it as tall, thin, and shadow-like, yet oddly visible against the backdrop of falling snow. When he blinked, the figure was gone. He dropped the kindling by the front step and ran home without knocking on the door. Similar stories began to surface. A farmer named Elias Boone, who lived just across the creek from the Parker family, said he witnessed flickering blue lights in the woods on multiple nights. These lights weren't like lanterns or candle flames, they moved in impossible patterns, swirling in midair, then vanishing without leaving a trace. He described them as cold lights, ones that didn't seem to illuminate anything around them, as if they belonged to a different world entirely. Boone's wife, Mary, reported hearing soft voices outside their window late at night, voices that sounded like the Parker sisters speaking in unison, even though by that time, two of the girls were already dead. Inside the Parker home, things grew even stranger. Ruth Parker reportedly began keeping the girls' rooms locked after each of their deaths, but visitors noted that the locks never seemed to stay latched. Doors opened on their own, even when bolted from the inside. The family Bible, which had sat on the same mantel for years, was found one morning with entire passages torn out, specific sections from the Book of Revelation and the Gospel of Luke. No one confessed to removing them, and Ruth was so disturbed by the discovery that she allegedly buried the damaged book behind the house. Several townspeople who visited the home during this period described an oppressive heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere itself had thickened. Some reported feeling dizzy upon entering, while others claimed their ears rang with a high-pitched tone that stopped the moment they stepped back outside. One visitor, a schoolteacher named Martha Gray, swore she saw reflections in the household mirrors that didn't match reality. In her account, when she glanced into a mirror above the fireplace, she saw the four sisters standing behind her, even though two of them had already been buried by that time. The image faded as soon as she turned around, but the memory haunted her for the rest of her life. Even the town animals seemed affected. Dogs refused to go near the Parker house, whining and scratching at their owners' doors if forced to pass by. Horses balked when led toward the property and sometimes reared violently, as if spooked by something unseen. Birds that usually nested near the mill stopped returning that winter, leaving the area unusually silent except for the occasional gust of wind rattling through the trees. As each sister died, townsfolk noticed that the surrounding environment seemed to shift subtly but perceptibly. Snow would fall in perfect circles around the Parker home while leaving other parts of the village untouched. The sky directly above the house took on an unnatural shade of gray, even when the rest of the horizon remained clear. Some said they heard what sounded like singing coming from the house late at night, not mournful or melodic, but a kind of low, rhythmic chant that seeped through the walls and into the frozen air. Those who ventured close enough to listen swore they heard more than one voice, though the Parkers claimed to be alone. These accounts were passed from neighbor to neighbor, but no one dared speak of them publicly in the town square or in church. Fear of ridicule, or worse, of drawing attention from whatever force was at work, kept the stories confined to private conversations and family circles. Even so, the pattern of strange, unnatural phenomena surrounding the sisters became impossible to ignore, leaving the townspeople in a constant state of nervous watchfulness, unsure whether they were witnessing grief-induced hysteria or something far darker. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Parker sisters' case was not just the eerie deaths or the strange phenomena, but the way official documentation of the events began to mysteriously disappear. In the weeks following the last sister's burial, the town doctor, Elias Cromwell, attempted to write a formal report about the deaths, as was customary in serious medical cases. According to his notes, he had already compiled detailed descriptions of each girl's symptoms, the timeline of their decline, and the unusual similarities between their conditions. He intended to send these reports to the Medical Society in Portland, hoping that doctors there might shed light on the mystery. But those records never arrived. When Dr. Cromwell visited the postmaster, he was shocked to find that the package containing his reports had vanished from the outgoing mail shelf. The postmaster insisted that he had not touched the package, nor had he seen anyone take it. The mail stagecoach driver also swore that he never received it. That same week, Cromwell's home office was reportedly broken into, though nothing else appeared stolen. The only missing items were his handwritten notes about the Parker girls. His personal journals from that month were also removed from his desk drawer, leaving behind an empty leather binding with the pages torn out. Similar disappearances occurred with the coroner's notes. After Clara Parker's death, the last and most violent of the four, a local coroner named Samuel Wicks was brought in from a neighboring county to conduct an independent examination. Wicks had no prior connection to the Parkers or the town of Parker itself. He performed a private inspection of Clara's body in the Parker home, refusing to allow witnesses into the room. When he emerged, he was visibly shaken, his face pale and his hands trembling. He carried with him a small journal filled with sketches, notations, and anatomical observations. He promised to deliver a formal statement the next morning, but that statement was never given. The next day, Wicks left town abruptly without explanation. His assistant, who had traveled with him, claimed the coroner burned his own notes in the fireplace of the boarding house where they stayed overnight. Witnesses at the boarding house said they saw Wicks pacing the hallway in the early hours, muttering to himself and clutching the journal before setting it alight. He left town before dawn, refusing to speak to anyone about what he had seen during the examination of Clara Parker. He never returned to Parker, Maine, and later withdrew from public medical practice altogether. Over the following months, additional documents went missing. Church records, which would typically include the dates of death and burial for parishioners, were found incomplete. The page that should have listed the Parker girls' names and burial dates had been torn from the parish book. When the town clerk was questioned, he claimed he had no knowledge of who removed the record. It was quietly accepted by the townspeople that those pages were simply gone, never to be recovered. Even the property records for the Parker family home later became problematic. Decades after the events, when someone attempted to purchase the abandoned Parker land, officials discovered that the original deeds had been altered. The Parker family's ownership history was either erased or left so incomplete that no legal transfer of the property could occur. Several attempts to rebuild on the land were halted due to legal complications, and eventually, the plot was left alone, overtaken by forest. In the years following the sisters' deaths, no medical school or scientific institution made any effort to study the case further. Some townspeople believed this was because the doctors and officials involved were simply too afraid. Others whispered about quiet warnings sent from higher authorities, cautioning local leaders not to stir up attention around the incident. Whether through fear, superstition, or deliberate suppression, the lack of documentation became part of the legend itself. A few surviving families in Parker, Maine, still speak of a locked drawer once kept by the town's oldest doctor, a man who took over Dr. Cromwell's practice years later. According to whispered family lore, that drawer contained letters, sketches, and fragments of the original reports from 1845, kept hidden away, unread, and untouched, because no one wanted to be the person responsible for reawakening what had happened. Some say the drawer was buried with the doctor when he died, others believe it remains hidden in an attic somewhere, gathering dust, sealed shut for good reason. The Parker sisters' case stands out not just because of its horror, but because of how carefully it has been avoided by the scientific community ever since it happened. In nearly every other instance of unusual deaths or medical mysteries from the 1800s, historians, doctors, and researchers have later revisited the evidence. Cases of mass hysteria, unusual diseases, or unexplained illnesses are typically studied for generations, especially when they involve multiple deaths within one family. But the Parker sisters have become an exception, a case so quietly erased from medical records that even today, few academic sources mention it, and no official medical study has ever been conducted. This avoidance raises an uncomfortable question: why? Why has modern science, with all its tools and advancements, shown no interest in examining this event? One reason might be fear of contamination, not of the body, but of the mind. Some doctors who came into contact with the case reportedly experienced strange symptoms themselves. There are accounts of at least 2 medical practitioners who visited the Parker home in 1845 and later suffered from night terrors, hallucinations, and prolonged states of paranoia. One of them, a physician from Portland named Dr. Hiram Leeds, reportedly retired from medicine entirely after reviewing Cromwell's initial notes on the case. He was said to have burned the copies he received, claiming the contents of the girl's final hours opened something that should remain closed. For years after, he lived alone in his house, refusing to see patients or speak publicly about the Parker family again. Even in the decades that followed, when medical science advanced significantly, no scholars took up the case for analysis. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scientists were cataloging rare diseases, studying neurological conditions, and investigating mass psychogenic illnesses, the Parker incident remained untouched. Libraries and medical archives from Maine show gaps where this case should have been referenced, yet it is consistently absent. Some say this was due to the loss of original records, but other sources suggest something more deliberate, a quiet agreement to let the story fade away rather than risk uncovering details that no one wanted to face. In the 1970s, a folklorist named Michael Calder attempted to write a paper on the Parker sisters for a northeastern journal focused on regional mysteries. He visited Parker, Maine, and interviewed elderly residents who still remembered the whispers passed down through generations. Calder reportedly gathered enough material to draft a full article, but before he could submit it, he withdrew from the project. According to his notes, which were later found among his personal belongings, Calder had received a letter from an anonymous sender advising him not to publish his findings. The letter warned him of unintended consequences, and hinted at prior researchers who had disappeared after digging too deeply into the story. Calder abandoned his manuscript and never revisited the subject again. There is also speculation that the Parker case is avoided because it challenges too many scientific boundaries at once. The symptoms exhibited by the sisters do not align with any known disease, then or now. Modern doctors who have reviewed secondary accounts say the pattern doesn't match typical cases of epilepsy, infection, or poison. The synchronized timing of the deaths is statistically improbable. The strange language spoken by the girls, documented in multiple witness accounts, raises further problems. It was not recognizable as any known dialect, yet the girls spoke it fluently while in their final states of delirium. There were no records of the Parker family studying foreign languages, and certainly none of the girls had exposure to ancient or obscure tongues. Beyond the medical questions, the surrounding phenomena complicate scientific inquiry even more. Lights in the woods, doors unlocking themselves, reflections in mirrors that did not match the physical reality, these reports fall outside the scope of traditional research. For a scientific community based on empirical data and repeatable experiments, the Parker case represents a threat to the very foundation of its methods. It forces researchers into a territory that feels less like medicine and more like folklore, which is uncomfortable ground for academic institutions. Some believe the silence comes from fear of professional ridicule. Any doctor or scholar who attempts to revisit the case risks being labeled superstitious or unscientific. In the modern world, careers can be destroyed by association with paranormal research, and the Parker incident sits squarely in that category. As a result, most researchers have chosen to steer clear, not because the mystery lacks value, but because investigating it could cost them credibility in the scientific world. There is also the lingering idea, spoken only in whispers, that the case might not want to be studied. Stories circulate about researchers who tried to reopen the Parker files and were met with personal misfortune, from sudden illnesses to unexplainable tragedies. Whether these are coincidences or not is unclear, but the fear remains. The Parker sisters' case leaves behind a haunting lesson that continues to unsettle those who learn about it, even generations later. It isn't just a story about 4 unexplained deaths or a series of strange phenomena, it is a reminder of the fragile boundary between what is known and what is not. It shows how easily human understanding can break down when faced with something that refuses to fit into any category of science, religion, or folklore. The Parker incident forces people to confront the uncomfortable possibility that there are events in this world that remain outside explanation, not because we haven't studied them enough, but because they may lie beyond the limits of what human minds are meant to process. One of the lessons this case leaves is about the danger of certainty. In most tragedies, people find comfort by assigning a cause, whether it's a medical diagnosis, an act of nature, or human error. Having a cause helps close the chapter and move on. But the Parker case denies that comfort. There was no clear diagnosis. No logical sequence of events that could be tied up neatly. The identical symptoms, the precise timing of each death, and the consistent reports of supernatural occurrences defy any normal chain of cause and effect. This forces people to live with a question that has no answer, and that in itself is a kind of psychological terror. It reveals how much humans depend on explanations, even bad ones, to feel safe. The case also highlights society's tendency to erase or bury things that make us uncomfortable. Instead of becoming a studied case in medical journals or forensic reports, the Parker story has become a whispered legend, deliberately avoided by science and academia. It shows how institutions sometimes choose silence over investigation, especially when a story threatens to break the rules of what they believe is possible. This leaves an entire category of mysteries locked in the shadows, not because they lack evidence, but because they carry implications that experts do not want to address. The Parker incident teaches us that sometimes the greatest censorship isn't by force but by fear, the fear of looking too closely at something that could unravel accepted knowledge. Another lesson comes from the way the local community responded. Parker, Maine, was a small town where people depended on each other, but during the months of the sisters' deaths, that trust dissolved. Neighbors began to withdraw, afraid to get involved or speak openly. Some isolated themselves entirely, refusing to visit the Parker home or offer support, even as the family descended into grief and chaos. This reflects a deeper human instinct. When faced with the unknown, people often retreat into silence and distance, hoping that staying away will keep them safe. The Parker case reveals how fear of the unexplainable can isolate communities, break social bonds, and leave families alone in their suffering. There is also a cautionary note about the limits of observation. Multiple witnesses claimed to see things that defied normal experience, lights that had no source, reflections that didn't match reality, whispers that came from empty rooms. But because these events fell outside accepted reality, they were dismissed or left unrecorded in official documents. The lesson here is about the gap between what is witnessed and what is acknowledged. People often ignore or forget details that don't fit into their worldview. The Parker story reminds us that many truths may be hiding in plain sight, but society has conditioned itself to look away when those truths don't align with existing frameworks. Another layer of the lesson involves legacy. The Parker sisters became symbols of something larger than their individual lives. Their deaths became part of a whispered history that refuses to die, no matter how much it is ignored. Stories about the girls continue to circulate in Parker, passed down from generation to generation, changing shape with each retelling but always retaining the core horror of the unexplained. This suggests that some events leave a permanent mark, not because they were fully understood, but because they were not. The lack of resolution becomes the legacy itself, haunting the town and shaping the way people talk about fear, death, and the supernatural. Finally, the case raises questions about the human need for control. Science, medicine, and law exist to create order, but the Parker incident slipped through every safety net. It stands as a reminder that control is often an illusion. No matter how advanced society becomes, there will always be mysteries that escape the grasp of experts. The story of the four sisters leaves behind an uneasy awareness that there are still dark corners of existence that we are not equipped to explore, and perhaps never will be. 2.